You've been warned. You don't have to start yet, but just in case people are tuning in. Oh, and then I need to get the other thing going. And back up.
Well, hello, where are we sitting down?
Anybody else coming?
Same place? You see around me.
I can see right through you. I can see
I'm not
through you.
transparent.
I see through you. Yeah.
It was okay, it's what happened.
Don't get hurt over
But
there.
I'll try not to.
I guess that Hamilton's getting until about 7.
Good morning.
Good morning. Looking at the clock back there, we've
You
got
didn't-
about 3 minutes.
You didn't get your coffee this morning.
I know, I'm trying to
Now
decide if that's going to be.
Now I feel like I'm being rude bringing mine.
We can share it.
Oh, good.
Anna's coming back with more coffee. Oh, okay. Harvey, you want a cup? I'll go get you one.
I could go get you one too, for that matter.
I wouldn't mind a cup, actually.
Decaf or regular?
I
I'll get it.
don't care.
Hot is the word.
Oh, we're waiting, we'll pass this up.
Left mine in the car.
This is different.
Oh, it's different? Oh.
Now, we're moving on up in the timeline.
Yeah, we're going to try to get up to 1,800 instead of 1,700.
I know, but I couldn't believe you missed it that far, so I gave it to you.
The last two numbers, like,
Yeah.
trying to get the right year and the century was.
I know. I couldn't believe it. He says 18, I just heard 17. Anyway, it's pretty funny. We're all pretty goofy.
Yeah.
No, last week we were supposed to go from 1,600 to 1,700.
Yeah.
This week, more or less, 1,700 to 1,800.
We were playing a game last night with them, is what we're talking about. And it's a fun game to play. You gotta kind of know your history a little bit. But the question was about when Delaware was the first one to ratify the new Constitution. And she said 1,879, and I gave it to her because I couldn't believe she'd missed it by 100 years. She only missed it by a smooth 100 years.
Yes.
Well, I got the last two.
You did, you got it perfect. And everybody went, no, that's not right.
Well, good morning. Good to see you all. Good morning. Welcome to you who might be on Facebook or YouTube. Last week we were trying to talk about the beginning of Lutheranism in North America. And we covered it, roughly speaking, from 1607 to 1680, actually 1703. So today we're going to try to talk about developments in Lutheranism in America from 1703 to the 1790s. So that's what we'll try to do today in this session. Before I get into that, though, I don't know how many of you get Living Lutheran, but they have a very interesting article about really the first and oldest Lutheran church in the Western Hemisphere. I say that because it was in the Virgin Islands among the Danes in 1671. So you might want to get a hold of that Living Lutheran. It certainly does not hide any of the sins of the past. It talks about the Danes and the Virgin Islands and slavery and this kind of thing. So it would be good. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, please do. Living Lutheran. So
What month is that?
that's January, February. So it's new. I'll pass out a couple of these sheets and then we will begin.
Here's some coffee for your dad.
Sheet that you can share. Are you sure about that?
Why are we dropping in the red?
Okay. Well, in any event, I chose the date of 1703 because it's the first Lutheran ordination in North America. And this gets into Lutheran theology. What constitutes the church? If we look at the Augsburg Confession, it would say that the church is the assembly of people wherever the gospel is proclaimed and the sacraments are properly administered. And you go on, it will also say that in order to have a call, they need to be done in good order. So for Lutherans, word and sacrament are rather essential. That's not true for all denominations. Some have what we Lutherans might call a lesser view of the sacraments, so sacraments are not such a big deal to them. But for Lutherans, if you're going to have a church, you need to have people, you need to have proclamation of the good news of God, and you need to have baptism and communion. That's essential for it. So when you get to America in colonial times, what are you dealing with? Well, you're dealing with people who have crossed the ocean and are forming a new community. Now, some of them may have come as communities. We'll get into that a little bit later. But in any event, they all have the same kind of experience of coming to a new place and establishing congregation. So what constitutes the church? Well, people, you got that. And you have the proclamation, because they could gather and read other people's sermons, if nothing else. And but sacraments, that gets to be more difficult. Because sacraments need to be done by someone who knows how to do them right. And so you need a pastor. And so you can have communities that gather, and but you don't necessarily have what we really would call the church. Martin Luther might quibble with that, actually, because he wrote a very interesting letter to the Bohemians. And he said, you know, when it comes to establishing the church, the community can choose out a pastor, and if they don't have one, and they can go ahead and do it. But that wasn't institutional enough for the Lutherans that followed. So, in any event, so this ordination of Justus Faulkner in 1703 was a rather major event. It was the first, what you might call, official Lutheran ordination. What made it official? Well, last week we talked about New Sweden. The Swedes came over, and as they came over, they settled, not very good at this, but they settled approximately in this area here, New Sweden. The Dutch were up here in New York and along the Hudson River up there. And the Dutch Lutherans were in the same place. So basically, around 1700, you had Lutherans primarily in two places, around the upper regions of the Delaware River and around the Hudson River in New York. So, but the Swedes had come in and established New Sweden in 1638. They actually supplied pastors, and they did that on and off for over 100 years. So you had a church that met all the requirements. You had a pastor, you had official recognition of it, and so you had Little Sweden. Well, Faulkner had gone to University of Halle in Germany. Now that's important because that's the center of Lutheran pietism. And he'd come over to America. Even though he'd gone to Halle, he had not decided that he wanted to be ordained. So he came over actually as a land agent for William Penn. And William Penn was the one who was trying to get people to come to his colony in Pennsylvania. And he opened it up to all different kinds of religions, and particularly the people who had been terribly persecuted in Europe, those Anabaptists that we talked about before, who were not official church people, but had their own Christian communities within the larger community and were constantly persecuted. So many of them came to Pennsylvania. But they weren't the only ones that came to Pennsylvania. There were a number of Lutherans that came as well. And when Faulkner came over to America and was working for William Penn, he had, you might call it, a minor conversion experience. He decided he could be a pastor. But who to ordain him, since he was a German? Well, he went and talked to the Swedish Lutheran pastors, and they said, well, we can ordain you. He scratched his head a little bit. There's no bishop around to ordain me. Can you do that? Now, the question would be answered as a no today, but back then, well, the King of Sweden had actually given kind of an ultimatum or a directive that the Swedes could actually ordain someone. Pastor in Sweden, Rudman, he could ordain someone. So after he talked with Faulkner about that, then they agreed, and so then they had this ordination in 1703. It's the first time that you have on North American soil an official Lutheran ordination. And he served congregations in Pennsylvania of where the Germans had come. Because when the Germans came, they came into Pennsylvania, but they moved all around here. A lot of them were in the Philadelphia area, and that's where his congregations were. That's where he served them. So that was Faulkner. Now, at the time that he was ordained, you had this situation in America. In the north part of the English America, up here, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, you have basically an established Puritan church. The Puritans came over to America not for religious freedom, but so that they would not be tyrannized. They would not be tyrannized. And so they proceeded to tyrannize any of the Baptists or the Quakers who happened to come around. So, and one of the Puritans was a man named Roger Williams. And he was a seeker. And he wasn't just willing to take whatever the church said. And so he went off and formed the colony of Rhode Island. The other people in Massachusetts called Rhode Island that cesspool of Massachusetts, where all these free thinkers went. So he was a rather devout man, Roger Williams. But so Rhode Island was different from the rest of New England in that it did allow religious toleration out of religious conviction. Now, in the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, in that area, it turned out to be practical toleration. Simply because people who did that for the most part were people out to make money. and they wanted people to come. So they weren't going to be too fussy about their religious beliefs. So as a result, they allowed a fair amount of religious toleration. It was a practical matter, not so much a well thought out theory of toleration. Now, in the South, you also have a couple of places that had theories of toleration. That was Pennsylvania with William Penn, and Maryland with Lord Baltimore or Calvert, because he was a Catholic. There's no way he could establish a Catholic church in America. He had the king owed him a lot of money, and so he gave him some land to pay it off. And if Calvert was going to have people to come, he opted for religious toleration. That means that Catholics too could be tolerated along with Protestants. So it was out of conviction for him that he did that. Now, south of that, we have basically Anglican establishment, where the Anglican Church is the official church, and people pay taxes and so forth in support of it. And they would allow dissenters to come because they were proceeding on a different kind of theory. The same exact theory, by the way, that happened in South Africa. In South Africa, in the 1820s, the British were fighting with the British had taken over South Africa as their colony, finally in 1810. And they found that these Dutch farmers, these Boers as they were called, were very stubborn. And they had different views about even the native people than the British did. And the British said, no, we can allow missionaries to come. The Dutch had said, no, we're not going to let it happen. Only Dutch pastors can baptize people, and we're not going to baptize these natives. So when the British came in, they had problems on two fronts. One, they had trouble with the natives, but also they had problems with the Dutch. So their solution was to see if they could find someone who could be a buffer between the native people and the Dutch. Who did they get? They found a number of Germans who were perfectly willing to come and do it. And so there got to be German colonies in South Africa. And so the Germans were performing what the government wanted at the time. And the same thing happened 100 years before in the United States, in the colonies. Because as people moved in, they moved into Pennsylvania, and since many of the people that came at first were the Anabaptist people, they took up some of the better land. When people came over, they often had to be indentured servants to pay off their way. Once they got done with that, then they would start moving. They moved along the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, and came south into Virginia. Okay, so that's the situation that we are looking at. And just to stop for a moment and go back, when we're talking about colonial history, you always have to look two places. We have to look what's going on in Europe. We'll have to do that all the time anyway. But also what's going on in America. Because the two interact and influence each other. And so one of the realities, one of the things that was going on in Europe was that there was conflict, continual conflict about one thing or the other going on in Europe. And this conflict often got described as religious wars. Religion is kind of a handy thing when you're going to war. Good to have God on your side. So in the midst of that, in the midst of these wars, they influenced how things happened. Now, it just so happened that in the late 1600s and early 1700s, in the English church, there was developing this philosophy of latitudinarianism, a fancy word, but these were divines that had studied and had said, we are fighting about so many things on religion. Let's just not do that. Let's agree upon the essentials, and let's not have conflict over everything. So these latitudinarians eventually would be very subject to rationalism, but in any event, that philosophy was at the edges and sometimes in the center of Anglican theology and practice. Now that also fed into another interesting political reality. Queen Anne had married a prince from Denmark who was a Lutheran. And so she was open to being kind to Lutherans anyway. And that's important because when we talk about the Palatines, Queen Anne was the one who said, yeah, you can come. You can leave Germany and you can come. And many of them, about 10,000 or so of them, came to England. And she wanted to ship them off to the colonies. But in any event, so she was open to that and she supported it. Top of which, when she died, she didn't have any heir. So the English Parliament was deciding who was going to succeed her, and they decided that Elector George from electoral Saxony and Hanover, he could be the next king. And he became the King of England, George I. He was a Lutheran. And he became the king. So, and he brought with him Lutheran advisors and Lutheran chaplains and so forth. And so, at that time, the Anglican Church was in pretty good terms with the Lutherans. And that was quite useful in the early 1700s. So, George I was king. And he was followed by his son, George II, who was also Lutheran. And the first George that was really a Brit was George III, who we Americans have some memory of. So the overarching relations between the British Anglican Church and the Lutherans was a pretty good one at that particular time. So, and in the midst of all of that, we had a number of Lutherans who came from the Palatine. I've got a little map here of Germany, and you can see the Palatine is down here, close to France and Belgium, Luxembourg, that area. That's where it is. And now that's got to be just kind of a name. It wasn't originally a Roman kind of province, but as it turned out, that place was subject to all kinds of wars because it's right between France and Germany proper, and they're constantly being overrun by war. So, and then the winter was very bad, and they had bad crops, and so the people were looking for ways to get out. And so Queen Anne said, yes, you can come. So they did. They came to England, and then they went over to America. First of all, most of them went to New York, but they came in waves and they went in different places. Some of you who are from Virginia would know that some of them, with the workings of Governor Spotswood or Lieutenant Governor Spotswood, said, come along, you can work for me. And so they came. In 1717, some of them came over to Virginia, and they settled. They moved a couple of times, but they ended up towards Madison, Virginia, and there they founded the first church that Hebron Lutheran Church. And they tried to get pastors, and it ended up being a difficult thing to do. Eventually, they found Pastor Jasper Stover, and he went and joined them in 1733, and got along with them pretty well. He was only there for about a year and a half, and then he went back to Germany to see if he could get some assistance in building a church and get some assistance in getting another pastor, so forth and so on. And he's actually succeeded. He did get a Pastor Klug, who got to be ordained. And you will note that Pastor Klug came out of the Lutheran Orthodox tradition, not the Pietist tradition. And that'll make some difference. As they were trying to get back to America, Pastor Stover died. So Pastor Klug came over and he took over Hebron Lutheran Church. Have any of you ever been to Hebron? Okay. You've been there. Any comments on the place?
We have a retired pastor here, the pastor at that church, Pastor Larson.
Good.
Jim Larson was pastor at that church.
Well, good. When it was built in 1740, it's the oldest Lutheran church in Virginia. It's always difficult to talk about when a congregation started. I think the people at Hebron claim that they were a congregation. They were a church from 1717. The sanctuary was built in 1740, so there's a little gap there. But, you know, when does the church start? I got into that kind of discussion when I was a pastor in Minnesota because they were talking about, well, we're going to celebrate our anniversary. I said, fine. They wanted to celebrate the year they were incorporated. And I said, okay, but really, when you started having a pastor and had baptisms and communions, that's when you were a church. Whether you had a building or not did not matter. And so, in that sense, I think our sisters and brothers from Hebron are right in saying 1770. But so, in any event, the other Germans went from the Palatine. They were in New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina. Some of them got started in a place called New Bern. We also came with some Swiss people. So they started their own congregation there. So this is just an indication that in the 1700s, before the American Revolution, there were a lot of Germans coming over to America. Often you would go to where your people with your own language and culture were, and then you would move out from there. And that history is what has happened in the Eastern colonies. So, I've put down there a number of these Palatine Lutherans because it's a very important thing for Lutheranism generally in the United States and for particularly in Virginia. Now, while all this was happening, they were immigrating, particularly in the 1730s, 40s, 50s. While they were immigrating, something else was happening in America. And that is to say, we had the development of what we call revivalism. The American theology can be traced as a history of revivalism. Now, what is that? The first person that really is noted for starting this American practice of revivalism was Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was quite the fellow. I admired him greatly. My prof, my church history prof back at Luther Seminary back in St. Paul back in the day said the three greatest American theologians are Jonathan Edwards, Abraham Lincoln, and Reinhold Niebuhr. So, I don't know if I think that was gospel word, but I don't think it's too far from it. But Jonathan Edwards was extremely interesting because he was a Calvinist through and through. He believed in predestination and all that kind of stuff. But he also could preach. And he's most famous, what he's most famous for is not what's most important about him. What he's most famous for was his sermon that he gave, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he has this nice image of a spider on a spider web above the flames of fire. And here you are as a person. And are you going to follow those flames of fire, or are you going to turn to God? That's that vivid picture that he has. And he, nevertheless, when he's preached and people started saying, we're going to turn to God, we're going to turn to God, we're going to repent, we're going to give up our evil ways. When they did that, then he wrote a book called The Work of the Surprising, Narrative of the Surprising Work of God. He was surprised that this was people's response. It was very emotional. And as time went on, he ended up writing another important work. It was called Treatise of Religious Affections. Because one of the things that he understood about Calvinism, and I could say Lutheranism, is that it's very head-oriented. And that when he wrote this treatise, he said, no, there's a place for emotions. There's a place for that. And you have to go through and see how emotions fit into all of this life and the decisions that you make. So that's his most famous work. He went on to become actually the president of Princeton University. It wasn't that called that at the time, but in any event, but he also died young because he was an advocate of the smallpox vaccination. And he took it and then got too much of it, and he ended up dying. So it was a great, great tragedy. But in any event, he was kind of the first revivalist who called people to repent and give up their sinful ways. Now, back in the 1740s, another person came down from England, another preacher named George Whitefield. And George Whitefield he could preach. They would say he would preach and the leaves would fall off the tree. He preached and people repented and they turned to Jesus, and he did a tour all the way up the coast. He connected with Jonathan Edwards up here. And there were a number of revivalist preachers and revivalist leaders. George Whitefield, who, by the way, became a pretty good friend of Henry Muhlenberg, and Gilbert Tennant, who became an even better friend of Henry Muhlenberg. And so this American revivalism was going on. You can study American history as a history of revivalism, and you can name the people, because you could start off with Edwards, and then you would go to Charles Grandison Finney, which we'll talk about probably more next time, and Dwight Moody, Billy Graham. And now Franklin Graham's trying to fill those shoes, whether he can or will is another question. But in any event, that's the thing that's going on in America. Revivalism. Remember, you have people out in the frontier by themselves, people who are centering upon the individual. And revivalism does that immensely. And so that reality is what's going on. And in the midst of all of that, here comes Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. And I could spend a lot of time on Muhlenberg. He was born in Einbeck, 1711. That's in just south of Hanover in Germany, about 30 miles. Nice little village. And it managed to survive the bombing in World War II because it had nothing in it except a brewery. And it's a beautiful little town. And Muhlenberg went to the University of Göttingen, which was just newly started, and it had strong influences from the Pietists. And he said, I better change my ways. And so he did, and he then also went to Halle to be amongst the Pietists. And then they sent him for his first parish, a place called Gross Hennersdorf. He was basically a chaplain or orphanage in this place. And one of the persons who was the ruler of Gross Hennersdorf was the aunt of Nicholas von Ludwig von Zinzendorf. And she didn't like her nephew one bit. Now I bring that up because this is going to be important. Zinzendorf ends up being quite important in all of this. Zinzendorf was a pietist. He was the godson of Philip Jacob Spener, who was kind of the founder of pietism. And Zinzendorf really was kind of lost. He got ordained as a Lutheran pastor, but he also invited this group of exiles into his estate. This group of exiles had come over from Bohemia. They had been followers, they were third or fourth generation followers of John Huss. And they were constantly persecuted when they were there in Bohemia, and they would go here and there, and other people would reject them and push them away. So they ended up coming to Zinzendorf's estate. And Zinzendorf really liked them, and together with them they had kind of an awakening, kind of a conversion experience. And Zinzendorf became very fond of them, and they came to be called the Moravians. And the Moravians were very interesting people. They too stressed emotions. If you look at our red hymnal, you'll find, our cranberry hymnal, you'll find several hymns by Zinzendorf. He tended to stress emotions and the blood of Christ. He was very much into that. He raised the ire of many of the pietists because he was so emotional. And not only that, but he thought he should go around and get Christians to combine no matter what their denominations were. They could be welcomed into his community. And so the Moravians also said, we've got this job to take the gospel out to the whole world. They were kind of forerunners of the missionary movement. And here they went throughout the whole world. They went to Greenland, they went to the Caribbean, they went to South Africa, they went to America. Zinzendorf himself came to America in 1740, and they established the Moravian community up here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And this finally got the attention of the leaders in Halle, because the poor Germans in America, after Faulkner had died and so forth, they were appealing, we need a pastor, we need a pastor. And the leaders in Halle, I've got things to worry about. But when Zinzendorf went to America, oops, we've got to get someone to stop this Zinzendorf. And so they had this call from these three congregations in Pennsylvania, and they said, Henry Melchior, we think you should go there. And he did. He first came into South Carolina, and then he took the ship again, went up to Pennsylvania, and near the end of 1741, he got to Philadelphia and the two other congregations that were part of the calling congregations. And so he began his ministry, and he was perfectly willing to travel here, there, and everywhere, there were German speakers, to help them. Plus, he had something that other people did not have. He had connections. He had connections with Halle. And Halle, the university there, and the institutions there, would help him to get other people to come be pastors. So he asked for them to send pastors, and they slowly and sporadically sent them. And he continued his peripatetic ways and ended up calling together pastors. And in 1748, you have the establishment of the first, I don't want to say establishment, but anyway, the first ministerium in America. That 1748 thing was just a gathering of pastors. And it was, and anyway, you can look upon it as a founding date in the way it was, because one of the things they did was they decided they could also ordain people. So this group could do that. So it was met sporadically from 1748 to 1760, and then thereafter it met yearly. So if I were going to date the ministerium, I would date it from 1760. But one of those things about history you can argue if you want. So anyway, I should mention also that when Muhlenberg later in life, they asked him if he could go down to Georgia. Why did he want him to go from Pennsylvania down to Georgia? Well, because the Archbishop of Salzburg in Austria decided, I don't like these Lutherans. And of course, he was operating under the whole theory of whoever the ruler is, the people should be. And so the Lutherans had to leave Salzburg. So they did leave Salzburg, but they went as a community with pastors. They went down to Ebenezer in Georgia, found a community there. But unfortunately, the church can do this. They had quarrels. And so Muhlenberg went down to try to see if he could placate the quarreling going. So the Lutherans, as we can see now, the Lutherans have spread from Georgia up to New York. That's been kind of their movements. Questions or comments? One of the things that you always have to keep in mind is that when Muhlenberg was there, he was very open to using different languages. He would preach in English, in German, in Dutch, and he was very open to that, and he knew that you had to be able to make that transition from your native language into English, and he was always in favor of doing that. So, and he also had a little different view than the Orthodox did, in that there was an Orthodox pastor up in New York named Birkmeyer, and he and Muhlenberg, they were both Lutherans, and they were both legitimate, but they both were not on the same page at all about how to structure the church and what the realities were. So Muhlenberg could be quite judgmental. He didn't get along terribly well with Orthodox people. And you can see that for him and Pastor Klug in Hebron. So he could be very judgmental. This is always to some degree, it's the difficulty of pietism. Because pietism wants to stress your religious experience and how you live out your Christian faith. And so it's got its eyes on how you're living. And if we watch each other carefully with our eyes on how they're living, we're going to find something that's not right. You don't have to even look too hard sometimes. So, and pietism is particularly susceptible to that. And Muhlenberg could be that. And that was unfortunate because he could go back and forth. While he was pastor, he married Anna Weiser. Her father was Conrad Weiser, and he was very well regarded by the Native American people. He actually was quite good whenever they had to have any kinds of a parley and an agreement with things. Both the indigenous people and the English people would say, "Gotta have Weiser. He knows he can chart, sail these waters." So, and he was Muhlenberg's father-in-law, which was a good thing. And so Muhlenberg was not as anti-indigenous as many other people around him until the French and Indian War, when many of the Germans who were sent to be buffers found themselves being attacked. So they developed rather negative views. Another thing we need to note about the Lutherans when they came is that unfortunately they were very quietistic in terms of whatever the government says is okay. Luther himself, even though he rebelled very much against the government, the Pope and so forth, he was very reluctant to upset any political apple carts. Took forever to convince him that it was okay that the princes could actually get together and figure out what to do in terms of political reality. Unfortunately, that theory was carried on when Lutherans came to America. There's a slave system here. It's a perfectly fine system. Not perfectly fine, but it's a system here. So we'll just adopt it and use it. And, I mean, we know at Hebron, for example, that they had slaves. The pastor himself had slaves, and that they helped to build that Hebron church. So there was not this political, prophetic voice amongst the Lutherans that came. That's part of the reality of it. And in the French and Indian War, that people said we're going to do what the government wants in terms of the war, and we see the indigenous people as our enemies. So now, Muhlenberg had 6 children, and well, they disappointed him. Not all of them, but John Peter Gabriel, he was sent with his brother Frederick, and they went back to Germany and went to Halle. And that didn't go very well, actually. The Halle people found them to be rude and wild, and they found the Halle people to be overbearing. So, but they went to school there, and while they were there, when he got done going to university there, he spent a year or two amongst the Germans and doing military things of all things. And then he came back to America and got to be ordained as a Lutheran. And then his father kept thinking, how can we help the people in Virginia? Because they don't have pastors. So he looked at his son and said, John, can you go? John said, yeah, but if I'm going to Virginia, I better be an Anglican. They only recognize Anglican as being legitimate. So he went over to England, was ordained by the Bishop of London as an Anglican priest, and then came back to America and went to Woodstock and became pastor there. And he was pastor there for a few years, and then the American Revolution came along, and I'm sure it's part of Virginia folklore that he was in the church one day and had on his clerical garb, and then took it off and had a military uniform. I don't put a lot of stock in that, by the way. You know, it's kind of like when I was a boy, you were taught George Washington chopped down the cherry tree, and I'll never tell a lie, and all of that. Well, some of these later biographers or hagiographers or whatever, they kind of are drama kings and queens, and they're going to add a bit. And I think they probably did that with him. And there's no doubt that he did leave the ministry and become a general in the American Revolution, and that he participated in a number of ways, including at Yorktown. So after the war was over, he went to Pennsylvania and got involved in politics there, and it was a representative in the Congress, where his brother was the Speaker of the House, the first Speaker of the House. And then he also got involved in other things and stayed in politics all of his life. His father was not happy about that. His father ended up saying, John Peter has chosen to bury his talents in the dunghill of politics. So, but in any event, Henry Melchior worked with the ministerium until 1776, when he moved from Philadelphia, which was right in the center of the war issue anyway. He moved out to Providence, track, and his health was also failing. So, and he was there from 1776 to 1787 when he died. He's buried behind Trapp Church. I've got a picture of that here. It's kind of an interesting looking church.
Pass it around?
Yeah, that's fine. In the back of it's a picture of Henry Melchior, which I wouldn't put much stock in either. What is true about it is, one, he had a wig, which is probably true. And two, he had on that the pastor's preaching robes, which was the German clerical garb. So, but in any event, that church was built in 1746, and unlike Hebron, they didn't just build onto it over the years. They left the church, and then they built another one in the 1820s. And so they still have the old one, and then they have this one as well. And right up on the back of that church is the grave of Henry Melchior Newman. And it's got and his wife, and then his son Peter. So they're in that cemetery. So that's it. So during the American Revolution and during the French and Indian War, the number of Germans coming over declined significantly. So they had a period of time when they could try to consolidate and develop their structures. During that time in America, after the 1783, the American independence, then you had the second, what we call the Second Great Awakening, and it was a revivalism as well, but it was the beginning. It was the beginning of the different kind of revivalism. Whitfield and Edwards were Calvinist revivalists. But the revivalism that started in the 1790s was a different kind of Calvinism. And it was less pastor-oriented. And the Methodists and the Baptists, they were the revivalism was constantly moving west, because people were constantly moving west. So that wherever people were moving, you would have a revivalist come along and preach to them, give up your sinful ways and repent and take Jesus as your Lord and Savior and change your life. So, and this revivalism went in different phases. And one of the second phases of it was, and the second and third phases was led by Charles Grandison Finney. Just a word or two about Finney. The difference between Finney and Whitfield or Edwards is this. When Edwards wrote and saw these conversions taking place, he wrote, a narrative of the surprising work of God. He was surprised. Charles Grandison Finney said, it's no surprise, there are laws for it. God has laws. You do this, this will happen. You do that, that'll happen. If you want to have a good revival, you pick out someone who you think is a terrible sinner, and you say, you put them on the seat right here, and you preach right to that person, and only that person. And pretty soon you'll have people quaking and falling down, and all the rest, shrieking and all the rest. Finney knew there are laws to do that. So he was not what you call Orthodox Calvinist. He was a very far Arminian Calvinist. This is one of the debates the Calvinists always had. They had it between the strict ones, Senator Dorr, and Jacob Arminius, who said, when God from the very beginning ordains who's going to be lost and who's not, God looks upon a person who's looking to God or a small response to him, and God takes that into account in his predestination. That was the big divide. The person you can see that probably exemplifies that divide as well as anyone is John Wesley. John Wesley lived in the 1700s, and he wrote a book. Wrote a letter, articles saying he started under the magazine. I guess we called it a magazine, the Arminian. Because he too was stressing that your human will, your human decision, that matters. And how you live your life, that matters. So in the revivals of the 1790s and thereafter, you will find more and more stress going on from the Baptists and the Methodists and so forth, which were saying, we stress the human decision, the human response, the individual. That's, we're getting now to the essence of modern revivalist thought. And it's still around today. And that's going to lay the groundwork for some of our discussions we're going to get into in the 1800s. Okay? Any questions, comments?
You talked a lot about the individual churches. Were they still a major minority for the Anglicans?
Well, there were it depends on what you mean by minority. The dissenters, as they would call them in those terms in those days, which I don't know if they put the Lutherans in that category, but they were more numerous than the Anglicans. Yeah, the Anglicans had the power. Yeah.
And also, during the Revolution, talk about Jefferson.
Sorry.
Jefferson was having his option of his abolition.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, next week, we'll try to go carry on.